Geysers are intermittent hot springs or fountains in which columns of water are ejected with great force at various intervals of time. This usually makes the water itself rise as high as 30 to 60 meters into the air, which is just amazing. Typically, after the water kind of spur ceases, a column of steam will rush out from the same aperture that the water came out of. And usually it does so with like a thunderous kind of roar to it. So Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park, which is in Wyoming for the most part, is probably one of the most famous geysers, if not the most famous geyser in the world. But there are other geysers that exist in other places as well. Some of them are in Yellowstone, but there are some, for example, in California, a lot in New Zealand, and a lot in Iceland. Actually, the name geyser came from the Icelandic language geisa, which I think means to spur out, basically. So we're going to look at this link, which is an example of how Old Faithful kind of goes off. Okay, so there it's starting. Water's starting to flow out. All right. So Old Faithful goes off, I think it's every like 45 minutes to an hour and 15. They have it pretty well tracked based on different things that they measure. And we'll talk about a few of them in a second. But so people tend to meet at the location where Old Faithful goes off whenever it's scheduled to go off, or a few minutes before, so that they can get a capture of this. As you see, it lasts about a minute to 2 minutes probably from the time that it starts kind of sputtering until the water ceases, and then the rest of the steam comes out. We'll look at the rest of the video. Yeah, they don't film the whole thing, but basically it goes for another minute or so until the water ceases, and then the rest of the steam comes out. So geysers occur when there is extensive underground chambers that are filled with water that tends to get heated. So typically these underground chambers will exist in areas where groundwater has kind of carved through and has made some underground systems in which the water accumulates. And then as this water accumulates in the chamber, it gets heated by the hot igneous rocks below, making the water pressurized enough in order to rise upward. So we'll go through that in a sec. So typically in this cavern-like structures, a cool groundwater will enter the chamber as it infiltrates through the rock. Once it gets in the chamber, it will start getting heated by the surrounding rock, which is hot due to the underlying magma. At the bottom of the chamber, so in areas like this one down here, the water is at great pressures because of the weight of the overlying water. So any water that would be above, I guess in this case, will create great pressures on this bottom part of the water, as well as any overlying rocks that exist. And so for these bottom waters at the bottom of the chamber, the temperature that is required for boiling will actually be much higher than it would be at the surface. So as you know, the boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius. At places like these where you have overlying pressure from water and from rock, the temperature for boiling is going to be like 230 degrees Celsius, so much, much higher. So the heating is going to cause an expansion in the water, which overall results in some of the water being released to the surface. So that's that initial sputtering that you were seeing from Old Faithful. With the loss of water, by the sputtering, there is also a decrease in the pressure from this upper part. So imagine it. So there's going to be some slight sputtering, so there's going to be less pressure overall on the rest of the water. So because there's less pressure on the rest of the water, the boiling temperatures are also going to become a little lower. So this areas down here no longer need temperatures of 230 degrees Celsius, but maybe only of 200 degrees Celsius. So it's going to be much easier to reach that point. At this point, once there's a little bit of sputtering and the temperatures needed for boiling are lower, the water that is here near the bottom is going to flash to steam, and hence is going to rise upward incredibly fast as steam, bringing up with it a bunch of the other water that you see as a big outflow. So after the eruption, obviously the water is now at the surface. Some of it does return underneath if it falls directly on top of it. But most of it goes to the surface. So new, cooler groundwater is going to fill up the chamber again, and then the cycle starts one more time. So as groundwater from hot springs and geyser flows out to the surface, the material that it carries with it is going to be material in solution. So it's going to be material that is carried within the water and is often precipitated out of the solution by the change in temperature that the water exhibits at the surface. This change in temperature, which precipitates the material out, produces these large accumulations of chemical sedimentary rock. So we have seen one of them in lab. It's called travertine. So if you guys remember, travertine is a type of limestone that occurs usually in caves, but it also occurs as sediment deposits basically from hot spring activity. So the chemical makeup of the precipitated material is often representing the material of the rocks through which the groundwater flowed through beneath and before it erupted or before it reached the surface. Most times the deposits are either going to be siliceous, meaning containing silica in them, and these are called sinter, or other times they're going to be containing carbonate material, in which case they are called travertine, like the one that we saw. So the image that you have right here is of Mammoth Hot Springs, which are in the northern part of Yellowstone, and this is a type of travertine. Many other places in Yellowstone, though, contain the more siliceous material, so the more silica-rich deposits. In fact, one of my research group members went to Yellowstone to collect sinter deposits in order to try to date the depressurizing system of the overall Yellowstone geothermal system, which is pretty complex, and they didn't manage to do it based on the samples that they got, but overall is one of the ideas. Okay, so sometimes also sulfur is a precipitated chemical from the water vapor that escapes through the fractures that are at depth. And it is typically sulfur, which gives hot springs and geyser areas the rotten egg smell that they have. So now we're going to look a little bit about geothermal energy. So geothermal energy, which is a type of renewable energy source, is harnessed when we basically tap natural underground reservoirs of steam and hot water. These reservoirs occur where subsurface temperatures are typically high, and these are high due to relative recent volcanic activity. So geothermal energy can be used for heating, but it can also be for electricity generation. So there are a few kinds or different ways in which this energy is obtained. One is through direct use, and the way this works is through using the near-surface heat from the soils to warm our homes, our sidewalks, our greenhouses, fish hatcheries, for example. So there's a lot of aquaculture that goes on through this way, and this happens also to heat up different city buildings. So, for example, in Colorado, I think up high in Colorado, not even lower elevation parts, where it tends to be very cold, there is use of direct geothermal energy for heating up aquaculture. So there's a bunch of actually alligator farms in Colorado during the winter. So it's kind of funny. Boise is actually the city, I think, in the US that has the most direct geothermal use per capita, which is awesome, I think. And then I guess a second way in which geothermal energy can be used is through power plants, through massive production, electricity production. So in this case, it is going to be larger drilling operations in areas where the geothermal gradient is higher, and this usually happens due to recent volcanic activity. Common areas in the US for this to happen are areas in California, Nevada, Utah, some in Oregon and Idaho as well. So as you know, because of the field trip and because of the short lecture that I did, Idaho has had relatively recent volcanic activity in the eastern plain of the Snake River. And so we have a relatively high geothermal gradient in our area. So these larger drilling operations are going to convert the high heat that happens at depth into electricity, and they actually provide close to 2% of the energy that is consumed in the US. The Geysers, which is in California, just a little bit north of San Francisco, is probably the largest geothermal installation in the world, and it generates nearly 1,000 megawatts of electrical power. And there are new developments that are occurring on geothermal energy as electrical plants done in Utah right now. So this new development is by the Forge project, and it is sponsored by the Department of Energy and led by Utah State University in this case, which were the winners to this kind of competition. So there are three main conditions that will favor the exploitation of geothermal potential reservoir for commercial uses. Those three things are a potent source of heat, such as a large magma chamber or recent volcanic activity that drives the heat. The second thing is a large and porous reservoir with channels that are connected to the heat source. So ideally, through this porous reservoir, the water can circulate as well, and it can be stored in the reservoir. And then thirdly, you need some sort of cap of low permeability rocks that will inhibit the flow of water or of heat all the way to the surface. So you need heat, you need porous reservoir, and then you need some sort of low surface or low-lying surface cap rock. So geothermal sources are, for now, unfortunately, a little bit too expensive in order to exploit on a wide scale. But I think there are potential for clean and renewable energy. And with the developing technology and scientific knowledge that we have, hopefully they will become a little bit easier to exploit in the future towards electricity usage. Okay. We'll go ahead and cover some of the environmental problems associated with groundwater. So, like many other valuable natural resources, the groundwater is being exploited to an increasing rate as of the last century or so. The overuse in some of the areas is actually threatening the groundwater supply. So in some other areas, groundwater withdrawal has caused the ground to actually subside and sink. Lastly, also, some of the areas that groundwater is being used is threatened because of contamination to the supply. So all of these are concerns for us to be aware of and try to target before they become major problems.